The show starts with a man named Harry narrating an experience from his childhood where his father had killed his mother and siblings on Halloween night in 1960. After he's done, the teacher of the adult class, Jake, as well as the members of the class are intrigued by the story so much that Jake praises Harry and even grades the story pretty well. Later that day, Jake is at a diner where the owner, Al, had just asked about Jake's day. Not long after, Jake's ex-wife, Alice, comes in and brings the divorce papers for Jake to sign, with Al then returning to the counter. While Jake and Alice are in the process of signing, Al goes into the inner room of the diner, looking suspiciously. When Alice leaves, Al returns looking really pale, and Jake doesn't understand what happened since he had just seen Al look perfectly fine. Jake wants answers immediately, but Al tells him to come the next day. On the following day, Al says there's no better way to explain the situation to Jake than allowing Jake to go through a closet. Jake doesn't understand this, but he agrees, and as he goes through, he surprisingly lands in a different place like he had just passed through a portal. There's a man there telling him he's not supposed to be there, but Jake doesn't listen and he just returns. Al tells him that the closet leads to the year 1960, and that was where he went while Jake was with Alice, and he had even spent 3 years there, though it's only 2 minutes in the present day. Al says there's only one reason why he's telling Jake, and it's so that Jake can do what he couldn't do, which is to stop the assassination of JFK by stopping the killer even before the shooting. Jake doesn't understand why this is such a big deal, but Al says he thinks the world would be a better place if JFK wasn't killed. Jake finds it hard to understand this, but Al goes further to show Jake some of his research that would help Jake when he chooses to cross over, including the names of people who could have had a hand in the assassination. He also gives Jake a book containing some games he could place bets on just to make some money when he's there. When Al is ready to let Jake go through, Jake says he needs to think about it, with this not going down well with Al, who asks Jake to leave since he didn't want to be useful. That night when he gets home, Jake finds it hard to sleep, and the next morning, he goes to Al, but finds him dead, as it seems the cancer he got while in the past had finally killed him. Jake, however, decides to still go ahead with it to fulfill Al's wishes. He goes in and follows Al's instructions to get a car and a place to stay. Jake also doesn't waste time in placing a bet, which he wins and makes some enemies as a result. After an attempt on his life, Jake has to leave town for Texas to begin plans to track a man named George, who Al believes could have been the handler of JFK's killer, Lee. While surveying the area where JFK would be assassinated, Jake meets a lady named Sadie, who has a similar interest in books like Jake. Jake also helps Sadie with her bag when she forgets it, before then going to meet her husband. Soon after, Jake finds an apartment, and that night when he tries to call his father, violent activities take place around him, with this also confirming Al's instructions to expect the past to push back if he tries to change anything. The next day, Jake tracks down George to an event where JFK gives a speech. He later gets into trouble with the Secret Service, who get him after he lies his way into gaining access to a section for important dignitaries while following George. After he's released, he keeps following George and finds out he's actually working for the CIA, and this could mean he recruited Lee. Later that night, Jake gets to the house he's staying, only to find it burning. When the fire's put out, he goes in and sees Al's research in the book of bets partially burnt. With this, Jake believes things would be much harder, and with that, he chooses to leave the town to return back through the portal. On his way, though, he decides not to go back without doing anything, and he chooses to save Harry's siblings and mother from being killed. Jake remembers Harry's story and uses it to find where Harry lives. He also sees Harry's dad, Frank, and has an encounter with him and his crew when they learn from a bartender named Bill that Jake, who had introduced himself as a writer, had been asking about Frank. When they meet, Frank sounds excited at the thought of a writer documenting something about people of his town. Jake realizes how bad Frank is and that he's actually having problems at home with his wife. In an attempt to stop the Halloween massacre, Jake gifts Harry's mom and his siblings ticket to a fun Halloween party. But Frank finds out and leaves his wife with bruises, after which he beats up Jake, with Bill seeing this as well. That night, Jake buys a gun and decides to take action on Halloween night. He plans everything out. But just as he's waiting to strike when Frank gets home, Bill interrupts because he's been suspicious of Jake. It turns out, he's also out to get Frank for killing his sister who had been married to him. When Bill still doesn't understand why Jake is out there, Jake tells him he's from the future and he knows Frank would murder his family that night. Things go just as expected, but Jake takes control of the situation and kills Frank before then choosing to leave town. He eventually makes a stop, and as he's justifying his reason for killing Frank, Bill shows up with the front page of a newspaper showing the news that JFK would be killed, with Jake apparently forgetting his things at the place he stayed and Bill finding it. Jake has to explain everything to Bill, and even though he had initially thought of going back home, Jake asks Bill to drive him to Texas to prepare to save JFK, saying he'd pay Bill pretty well. When they get to Texas, Bill says he wants to help, and seeing as he could use some help, Jake is happy to bring in Bill to save JFK together. They decide to go with the story that they're brothers, and for their mission, Jake gets them 2 houses, with one being in a small town where he gets a job as a teacher, and another where they'd be neighbors with Lee when he arrives from Russia. Before Lee arrives, Jake and Bill bug the entire house, and as Lee moves in, they're able to hear everything he says while in the house. George also happens to show up sometimes, and as Jake and Bill keep watch of both men, they realize that George is actually riling Lee up to kill a man named Walker, who is a general who has a different view of a better America from what Lee believes in. Lee also happens to let Walker know this, with Jake and Bill present to see this. Meanwhile, Jake continues to work at the school, and there, he meets Sadie again as she's going to be the librarian at the school. He falls in love with her, though things seem to fall apart when she figures out he's hiding something from him. Despite claiming to have left her husband, Johnny, he shows up in the town rejecting to sign the divorce papers. He also makes an attempt to threaten Jake when he's out tailing George. However, Jake puts him in his place, using an embarrassing experience from his past, in which Sadie had told him to make a joke of Johnny and get him off their backs. Elsewhere, Bill also seems to be very interested in Lee's wife, Marina, even though she has a baby with Lee. Several times when Lee would beat Marina, Bill thinks of interfering, but Jake stops him to prevent having any contact with Lee. On the night when Lee is expected to shoot at Walker and miss the shot, Jake can't be there to see who takes the shot, despite Al telling him that if Lee took the shot, then he'd be the one who shot JFK as well. That day, Jake gets a call from Johnny, who is at Sadie's house, to take his revenge for what Jake said to him. He tells Jake to come over, and this lets Jake hand over the job of finding out who tried to kill Walker to Bill. At Sadie's house, Johnny has torn through a part of Sadie's face, and he also tells Jake to drink from a glass of bleach. Luckily, some students come over to see Sadie, and while answering the door, Jake tells them to call the police. Not long after, Jake was able to pour the bleach on Johnny's face before he and Sadie managed to work together to kill him. Sadie loses consciousness and she's taken to the hospital. Meanwhile, Bill meets Lee for the first time after Lee sees Bill talking to Marina on the stairs. He also gives Bill a Karl Marx book, saying he'd be happy to talk to Bill about it later. As planned, Bill arrives at Walker's house that night, but he gets distracted and doesn't see who took the shot, with Jake feeling disappointed after hearing this. Weeks later, Marina moves out of the house after getting fed up with how Lee treats her. Lee, however, continues visiting Marina at her friend Ruth's house. Amidst everything, Lee also gets to know that an FBI officer named Hosty has been going to see his wife, and when he finally meets the officer, he shares his thoughts of how he felt he was being violated. Around the same time, Lee also gets a job at a book depository where he will be reportedly taking the shot at JFK. And on getting to know of this, Jake asks Bill to continue keeping tabs on Lee and also George, while he takes care of Sadie, who he now has told the entire truth about himself. However, Jake comes home one day only to find Bill mingling with Lee and his family, while also kissing Marina when they're alone. To make matters worse, Lee finds one of their bugs in his room, but luckily, he blames it on Hosty and the FBI. Jake is very angry about this, and he lets Bill know how he feels. Things take a wrong turn pretty fast and they exchange blows, with Bill eventually threatening Jake with a gun and asking him to leave and never return, or he'd tell Lee everything. Jake is unhappy with this, but he's currently only concerned about taking care of Sadie, who's about to have a cosmetic surgery to remove the scar Johnny left on her face. At the hospital, Jake sees the weird man he had seen in front of Al's portal, and he suspects that something is wrong. He breaks his way through the surgery room, and interestingly, it turns out that something was actually wrong and Sadie could have died. Things are back to normal and Jake decides to settle things with Bill. But on getting to the house, he sees Lee and Bill practicing how to shoot. And the thought of a second shooter pops into Jake's head, as it had been one of the conspiracies about the assassination of JFK. Jake decides to take action, and it's not long before he commits Bill into a psychiatric hospital. That's not all he has to do, though. And he also goes over to threaten George to see if he knows anything about the scheduled assassination. It turns out George knows nothing, and with this, it only points to the fact that Lee was working alone and he needs to be taken out. Jake calls Sadie to tell her he's going to kill Lee. But before he can do anything, a bet he placed in the past comes back to haunt him. As it turns out, he and Bill had placed similar bets at different places owned by the same man, and he doesn't take it lightly as he makes sure to beat up Jake badly, that he has a head injury and can't remember anything. Days before the assassination, Jake cannot remember the name of the assassin, and even where Bill is. He eventually remembers the latter and tries to get Bill to tell him who they'd been planning to kill, but Bill's mind is now messed up, and just as Jake falls for his release, Bill falls from a window and kills himself. Days continue to pass with Jake not remembering anything about Lee, but he soon recollects the name of the place he used to live, and with Sadie's help, he's able to locate his house and also remember Lee. Jake decides against killing Lee immediately because there's a baby in the house, but when he gets home, he tries to leave sneakily to get it done. Sadie catches him and she forces him to let her come along. He agrees, and they decide to work together. Meanwhile, Lee goes to the FBI office days before the assassination and complains about Hosty, but his report is not taken seriously. He, however, writes a letter and drops it off for Fosty before he leaves. After a failed attempt to reach Lee's gun before he takes it, Jake and Sadie are left with the option of stopping Lee on the day of the shooting. They decide to stay close enough, and that night before the assassination, Jake zones out and sees the man from the entrance of the portal again. This time, the man tries to advise him, saying he can't change the future and Jake would only find himself in a loop, just as he has with his daughter, who he had been trying to save severely until he got old. When he's back to reality, Jake tells Sadie he's scared and he's no longer sure, as he feels they should let history run its course. Sadie says he came for a reason and he has to do it. That night, they sleep off and eventually wake up just a few hours before the shooting. The car doesn't work, and Jake figures out that the past is trying to push them back. It even gets worse as Jake bumps into the ghosts of Frank, Johnny, and Bill. He manages to get over this and continues to aim to reach the scene of the crime right in time because all 3 shots Lee reportedly takes, he misses the first one, and that can be their window to save JFK. Meanwhile, Lee has prepared his gun for the shot as he tries to be calm. On the other hand, Jake and Sadie reach the building just as JFK's motorcade is about to pass, and despite meeting the door to the building locked, Jake has to threaten Lee's co-worker to open it and also report to the cops that Lee was about to kill the president. From there, they take a long walk to the 6th floor, and as JFK passes, Lee takes the first shot. He misses as expected, and as he's about to take the next shot, Jake and Sadie are right on time to stop him, though he's pissed and wants to kill them. After a while shooting around, Lee is attacked by Jake, who then kills Lee. Just then, Jake finds out that while Lee was shooting around, he had shot Sadie. Sadie is unable to make it, and she dies, with cops then coming in to arrest Jake. When he's in the interrogation room, the police chief doesn't believe Jake's story that Lee had told him he was going to kill JFK, and that was what led him to the building to stop Lee. Hosty is also in the room, and as Jake seems to accuse Hosty of knowing about Lee's intentions, Hosty asks the police chief to leave, saying the FBI was now in control. As the police chief leaves, Hosty tries to threaten Jake, but Jake doesn't fall for it as he even says Hosty's superior will come in and ask him to burn the letter Lee had written to Hosty, implying he'd do something that would change the world. The exact same thing happens and Hosty is surprised, but before he can get the answers he's looking for, JFK calls to thank Jake and gets released afterwards. From there, he heads back to the portal, but as he enters, Al's diner is no longer there, and the town looks like a war zone. Jake soon finds Harry, and while they're at an abandoned factory that Harry says he's now living in, Harry says he remembers Jake as the one who saved him and his family. He, however, wonders if Jake is an angel because he still looks young, but Jake says it's hard to explain. Harry goes further to say that things weren't better for his siblings after that, and he lost connection with them after their mom died. Jake asks about JFK's tenure, and he learns that things were not as better as Al had said, and a war had even happened during the tenure of the next president. Jake says he's got to go back and reset everything, but as he enters through the portal, he sees Sadie and goes after her. He, however, decides against bringing her along or spending time in the past as it would only keep him in a loop like the other man. He says goodbye to her and returns how he left things. Much later, He searches for Sadie's name online and finds out she's to be awarded for her outstanding work as a librarian in a small town. Jake goes there, and as she's awarded, he sees a very much older Sadie. After receiving the award, Jake asks her to dance with him. An older Sadie is amused by how happy he is just by looking at her. Jake asks her if she had a better life, and when he hears it was good enough, he smiles and says it's what she deserves.